So hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Trevor Coral. I'm a digital video producer with Reuters in Toronto and working with the RTDNA as a webinar producer. We want to get right into it, so I won't say too much, but we're very happy today to welcome Tom Walters, correspondent with CTV National News. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. There will be some time for questions at the end. There is a chat option where you can message us, and I will read out your questions. And if you want to submit anonymously, there is an option to do that as well. And I will, again, I will read those out at the end. So without further ado, let's get started and throw it over to Tom. Tom, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Trevor. And thank you to everybody for being here today. I particularly want to thank RTDNA for inviting me to do this, and Trevor for everything he's done. I'm very conscious in talking about this of how much I owe to the things I've learned from others in this business and the things I continue to learn from them. And I hope that there's something here today that you find useful in your work. What I'd like to do today is speak in a fairly personal way about what I think is really the essence of storytelling, and share a couple of early experiences that continue to influence what I do. Beyond a few absolutes, like getting the facts right and being fair, a certain amount of storytelling is personal. But at the same time, I think there are some things that objectively can help make our stories better. I want to leave a lot of time for questions later on, so I'm going to try and move fairly quickly through some key points here. But mainly what I'd like to talk about is some specific ways of writing to pictures, about how we engage viewers through the language of emotion. I'd like to speak briefly about endings as well, and the importance of them. But I think all of these things are really connected, and the starting place is focus. When I was news director at CTV in Vancouver, I saw a lot of tapes, and back when they were tapes, and I noticed that when reporters were struggling, it was often with the same thing. The ideas they expressed were a little too vague, a little too general. Their stories weren't as clear or as precise or as vivid as they might have been. And I'm talking about things like this. If you were to sort of distill that kind of storytelling down to one sentence, it would be something like this. Area residents are upset about the proposed truck route. Now, the first point I'd like to make is that video does not speak in generalizations. Every picture is a picture of something or a picture of someone. So what are we going to show when we refer to area residents? A generic street shot of the neighborhood? That compounds the problem, because then general words can end up forcing us to use wallpaper pictures. Now, the first and most obvious remedy, of course, is to introduce an idea with something specific and let the specific be an example of the general. In this case, we could show pictures of one resident of the area and say something like, Sandra Lee is upset about the proposed truck route and she's not alone. But that still leaves a lot of room for improvement. What does it even mean to be upset? And I'm betting that if people in the neighborhood are upset, it's not over a proposed truck route per se. Instead of being upset, people may be angry or they may be fearful. And it's not about the truck route, but it's about the particular way they think the truck route is going to affect them. Maybe more traffic, dangerous streets, lower property values, things like that. So the point is, pictures are specific and concrete. And I think that our words should be too. So instead of saying area residents are upset about the proposed truck route, how about Sandra Lee is afraid that it won't be safe for her daughter to walk to school? I like the second sentence better. And there's a question that I've found helpful in getting from the first sentence to the second one. For the record, it's not one of the 5 W's. Now, the 5 W's are fine as far as they go, but I've never found them to be very helpful in helping to identify the real heart of the story. Who, what, when, where, and why are a checklist so we don't miss something important. But what they give us is a list of facts. And a list of facts is not a story. When it comes to identifying or sharpening the focus of a story, the question that I find the most helpful is this: what's at stake? I would argue that in any story, more or less by definition, there's something at stake. It might be an outcome, a principle, a desire, survival, hope. It could be a dream, it could be money or power or advantage or pride. Even with a light kicker, there's something at stake, even if it's just a sense of fun or playfulness. And of course, we know that conflict arises when different people see different things at stake. Now, I'm not saying that we go around asking people in interviews literally what's at stake for you, or that we necessarily declare in the story what's at stake for each party in the story, although we certainly could. I'm saying that I find this helpful as a tool, as a question to ask ourselves, what's at stake? I think this helps us find the focus of the story. Now, however we do that, it's certainly important that we do. Lack of a clear focus, not really knowing that crucial idea in the story, leads to a number of problems in reporting. I was discussing this with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things it leads to is weak questions. Because we're sort of flailing at some kind of shapeless blob. It's like hitting the sofa with a tennis racket or something when we want to be sticking a scalpel into an exact spot with a question. It leads to something else too. And I think that's too many facts and not enough detail. Those might sound like different or even contradictory things, but I think they're often connected. If we think back to a moment when we weren't entirely clear on the focus of a story we were working on, what was our option? What was our alternative? Really list a bunch of facts and hope they mean something. There's a saying that the way to sculpt a horse is to start with a block of stone and then take away everything that's not a horse. And that's why a list of facts is not a story, because a list of facts is a block of stone. We need to know what our story is. We need to figure out what a fair and accurate image of a horse would be so that we can take away all the other stuff. Because like a sculpture, anything that's not part of the horse is in the way of seeing the horse. If our story gets cluttered with data that's not necessary for balance or for understanding of the central idea, then it's not just the focus that will suffer. There will be less time, I think, and it will be harder just to identify the kind of detail that we could be using to make the story more vivid and more memorable. There's another old saying, always get the name of the dog. And that applies even when it's not a dog, as CNN's Bill Weir once demonstrated.
I'm riding into the valley of the shadow of death on a donkey named Apricot.
Now, not everything needs that level of detail, but as a viewer, I'm going to have a reaction to riding into the desert on a donkey. And I'm going to feel, speaking for myself, I'm going to feel a stronger reaction if it's the valley of the shadow of death and it's a donkey named Apricot. And let me say that again. I feel a stronger reaction. So let's talk about our feelings, shall we? We're really talking here about emotional engagement. And a couple of years after I started working in television, and this goes back to, well, a long time ago, barely past the era of cave drawings, 1984, there was a catastrophic famine in Ethiopia. And the BBC and the CBC were the first networks to cover it. Their stories were picked up in a lot of other places, other coverage followed. And the world responded with a massive fundraising campaign. Bob Geldof famously got a bunch of British musicians together to perform a song called Do They Know It's Christmas? The Americans responded with We Are the World. And in Canada, a group of all-star musicians, or an all-star group of musicians, gathered to do a song called Tears Are Not Enough. And if there's anyone who hasn't seen the video for that or doesn't remember it, let me remind you how it started.
All across northern Ethiopia, famine is along each road and at the gates of every town. It's feared close to 1 million could die within months, unless the world responds with a massive relief effort.
As every day goes by.
As I hope most people will know, that opening voiceover is part of a story by the great CBC correspondent Brian Stewart. Now, just for starters, I remember being terribly impressed by the poetic quality of his writing. Famine is along each road and at the gates of every town. That's a literary device. I mean, he's personifying hunger and turning it into something like a physical presence. But I think more importantly was the fact that just a couple of stories on television were met with such a massive response. And that led to an analysis piece in the New York Times. Now, it concluded that there was something television journalism could do better than print journalism. I agree, of course, but I remember thinking back then, if the New York Times is saying that, maybe I should pay attention. This might be important. In fact, the Times noted that TV is not all that good at communicating data. And I think we know that's true. That is not our greatest strength. How many of us actually remember a statistic we've seen in an on-screen graphic? On the other hand, as the Times said, what TV does better than any other medium is engage the emotions. Let's think about that fundraising song again. Possibly the most evocative, emotionally evocative art form we have is music. And yet here was a group of musicians harnessing the emotional impact of television journalism. For me, as a beginner in TV, that was really a formative moment. It seemed to me that if we're that much better at emotional engagement than any other medium, then we shouldn't even just think of it as our advantage. Maybe we should think of it as our language. That's not the same thing as emotional manipulation. When I talk about emotional engagement, it's really the idea that the way we communicate information should take into account the way people receive it. And I think as viewers, we can all agree that what we absorb and what we retain, in effect, the way we process information, is going to be different depending on whether we're looking at something that presents us with data, or we're looking at something that conveys information by connecting with our emotions. In the case of the Ethiopian famine, pictures of those who were so stricken by that crisis. I'm going to come back to this point because there's more to say about it. But as I see it, the two ideas that we've talked about so far, what's at stake and emotional engagement, are really the alpha and omega of storytelling. Over time, I started to think of them as connected, and that really what we're trying to do when we tell a story is give people an emotional understanding of what's at stake. That may be theoretical. How do we apply that in practical terms? Well, first of all, if emotional engagement is the superpower of visual storytelling, then it's because it is visual storytelling. So it's the pictures, it's how words and pictures interact. People in our industry often talk about writing to pictures, but I think there are a number of ways of doing that, and I wanted to break some of them down today. The most obvious way is what I would call descriptive. This is where we have video of a specific moment or event, and the voiceover is a literal narration of what we're seeing.
Security video shows her in distress, fanning herself with her hat. Moments later, her hand gets shaky, she loses her grip, and while her head nods, her hand drops even further from the wheel. The bus is out of control.
The second way of writing to pictures is what I think of as illustrative. We don't refer to the video specifically or describe it literally. We make a statement and then use pictures to illustrate and support that point.
Who's with me on that?
Lake is the Republican candidate for governor, and by all appearances, generating more excitement than the Democrat now running for that job, Katie Hobbs.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on those two ideas because they're important ways of writing to pictures, but I think they're also fairly basic and self-explanatory. And by the way, there are a lot of people's work I could be using here as examples. When I use examples of mine, it's at least in part because I knew where to find the clips. A third way of writing to pictures is to do it metaphorically. And here's another early formative moment for me. I'd been in television for about 20 minutes when I had a chance to sit with a great Vancouver reporter named John Daly, who was looking at video for a story that he was working on. And there had been a gruesome and at that point still unsolved murder in a provincial park in BC. And so the number of people visiting that park had dropped sharply. And John was doing a story about the few people, the nervous people who were still camping in the park. And we were looking at shots of the campers that he'd interviewed, one of the campers in particular, and up pops, a really pretty image, a close-up of a bird on the picnic table. And in my naivety at the time, I said something like, oh, that's a nice shot. Too bad it's not part of the story. Well, John was much too kind to tell me how foolish that was. He just said, oh, I think I can find a way to use it. Now, of course, he could just have used it to explain why this guy was still camping. He's attracted by the beauty of nature, cue the bird. But what John did was far better than that, I think. Now, I can only roughly paraphrase the first sentence of his story, but I've never forgotten the second. He starts with this guy in the campsite, whatever his name was, and says something like, as Joe Blow camps in Wells Gray Park, he's on guard. The Stellar's jay is the only intruder he'll allow. Well, at that point, the bird isn't just decoration. It was a metaphor for any intruder, good or bad. And that really goes to the heart of the story. Pictures are evocative. And what John had done is tied one of his best pictures to the most important idea. Here's an example that's not as elegant, but it's another case of using a visual detail as a metaphor for an idea. This was from a story about the impact on the economy and on May Day celebrations when Mexico City was shut down over swine flu.
It's a reminder that May Day can be a holiday or a cry of distress. And it's not just a puppet that hangs by a thread for a vendor on an empty street.
Now, I think the metaphorical use of pictures can be applied in much smaller ways, too. Not necessarily representing a big idea, but sometimes just to underscore the words we use.
This is not courtesy between countries, it's kindness between people. And so, for a moment, it's as if the world is in our hands.
I should add here that the relationship you have with the person who is editing the video is really part of the craft here and a vital part of the craft, and editors bring an enormous amount to this process. I have the good fortune of working with a guy named Chad Tweeton, whose eyes are always open to those kinds of moments. A fourth approach to writing the pictures is what I think of as writing to the mood of the pictures. When we're looking at video for a story, there will be shots that make us feel something for whatever reason, often for reasons that are not literal or based on the event. But that doesn't mean that those feelings are useless to us. My former colleague, Janice Mackey-Freyer, used one of those impressions in a story that she filed from Gaza.
Who
Time of death, 10:30. Age 5. His body wrapped in cloth, cinched like a candy, and taken to the morgue.
Cinched like a candy. That's not like our other metaphorical uses of pictures. It's not that we see a candy or that candy is somehow symbolic for a child's life. It's just an impression she's drawn from the video that I think adds emphasis. You know, we can see for ourselves the tragic brutality of that moment. But I think that feeling is intensified by really the shocking comparison to something that it's an innocent pleasure. A less dramatic example, I was doing a story about the aftermath of a plane crash. And there was a shot I liked as an opening because there were birds, you know, scattering in front of a train that was carrying the bodies of the dead. These things were not connected in any way, but it just felt to me like birds in flight added a bit of poignancy to lives lost while flying.
Birds still take to the sky, but passengers from a fallen plane now travel by refrigerated rail car.
When we talk about writing to pictures, I should probably say a few words about contradiction. When words and pictures disagree, it's a major problem. It's cross-scripting. We don't want to do it. First of all, when words and pictures disagree, the pictures win. They just do. To the point that if you're stuck with pictures that don't really suit what you're describing or contradict what you're describing, I think your only chance is to acknowledge that. You know, something like Harry and Meghan, just to pick two completely random names. Harry and Meghan are all smiles here, but privately they are seething mad. If you don't acknowledge what the pictures show when you're trying to say something else, I think you're in trouble. Now, that said, contradiction can be used deliberately if the contrast is obvious enough. I'm not sure how you do it for a serious story, but you can certainly do it in a humorous one where the joke is that you're wrong. You know, something like, you know, Steve is pushing himself to the limit of endurance with a grueling regime of physical training, and your video shows him sitting in a lawn chair with a Slurpee. Saying words that conflict with something obvious, I think, is closely related to saying words that ignore something obvious.
Glittering under a California sun, it could be any classic Cadillac convertible. But the difference is plain to see when you say, fill her up. Now, anything that's half Cadillac, half hot tub is bound to offer a certain amount of luxury. But this car wasn't just built for comfort. It was built for speed.
So I've come to terms with the fact that long after everyone has forgotten that I ever did any other story, somebody will remember that one. In a funny story, I prefer to be the straight man, to set up a situation where the visual elements are funny. I think that was still in my lane, barely, but I think it was still in my lane because I was playing the stand-up straight, ignoring the fact that I was sitting in a hot tub in a jacket and leaving it for the viewer to see that absurdity. And that brings me to one more way of writing to pictures, which I've saved for last because I think it's my favorite. This is what I would describe as viewer involvement. If you tell the viewers everything there is to say, they're passive spectators. If you leave something for them to notice themselves, they're involved. And here's an example. This was from a story done by the Discovery Channel about sinking an old US naval vessel to form an artificial reef. It's a big job to prepare a ship for sinking. And a guy named Mike Campbell was heading the team that was doing that, working on a ship called the USS Mohawk.
For more than a year, Mike Campbell has lived and breathed the USS Mohawk, and it shows.
It's been an obsession.
In my opinion, that is perfect television writing. You know, as reporters, I think we often want to be the ones who know everything and can tell the viewer. So it would be tempting to write something like, for more than a year, Mike Campbell has lived and breathed this project, and even his haircut is a mohawk. And that's not bad. That's writing to pictures. But for viewers, it's the second-hand experience of being told. The discovery story gave them the first-hand experience of noticing for themselves that the guy's haircut is a mohawk. And that story even helped them get there with that little cue. And it shows. In other words, there's something here to notice. When information is vital to the viewer's understanding of the story, we can't afford to be cute with it. We've got to be as clear as possible. But in this case, they'd already told us that Mike Campbell was obsessed with this project. So the detail of the haircut was something that could safely be left as an opportunity to give the viewers something to do. Because I like this technique, I'm going to show a couple more examples of it.
But in the meantime, those in the grip of the storm can only wonder what else it will deliver overnight.
Sometimes this can be a way of saying more than we actually want to put into words.
To the next generation of dreamers.
Billionaires launching space tourism companies are bound to inspire some cynicism, as if it's just the latest way for those comparing their fortunes to say mine is bigger than yours.
That might not be an example you'd want to use in every time slot or every market, but I discussed that with the executive producer before I did that. And we thought that if we're going to tweak the noses of billionaire space adventurers, and by suggesting there might be some vanity involved, the implications of that image were something that viewers would notice. And by acknowledging that, it's sort of our way of saying, yeah, we see it too. One of the reasons that I like this idea of giving the viewer something to notice is because it brings us back to the idea of emotional engagement. Outside of journalism, I guess a common form of storytelling that's meant to engage the emotions is a joke. And to make us laugh, most punchlines require some involvement from the listener. Often the punchline is a prompt that tells us how to connect the last couple of dots and see for ourselves something that's funny. But if we try to spell everything out, as we sometimes do as reporters, you can end up with this as a punchline. Well, the chicken wants to get to the other side, which is hilarious because it's so obvious and because it's what anyone else would be thinking when they tried to cross the road. If a punchline has to explain itself and explain why it's funny, it's not. In the same way, I think a story that would engage the emotions may be more successful in doing that if it doesn't overtell. I often see stories that are sad or joyful or inspiring or uplifting, where the reporter tells us they're sad or joyful or inspiring or uplifting. But should we be doing that? We talked earlier about sharing those things that we observe ourselves, cinched like a candy. Detail can help to evoke emotion, but should we be going as far as saying what that emotion is supposed to be? If this was a rule, I would have broken it many times. And certainly we want the people that we're interviewing to be direct about what they're feeling. But should we, in our story, use words like happily or sadly? Should we call something inspiring or heartwarming? Can we engage someone's emotions just by naming an emotion? As an experiment for today, I rewrote the end of a story that I did a while ago, and I'll show you both versions, the original first. But to set this up, a few years ago, there was a short film called Buzkashi Boys about two Afghan kids who wanted to be stars in that country's national sport. In the end, the film is about the way dreams get lost in the trap of poverty. The focus of our story was that the film actually created an exception to its own premise. It opened up new possibilities for one of its young stars, Fawad Mohammadi. Now, in the story, we connect with this kid right away because at the start of the story, we see him when he learns that the film has been nominated for an Oscar, and he's just overcome. I'm only going to show the last part of the story, but what all this means is a new life for this kid who was poor, and somebody the producers had discovered while he was selling maps on a Kabul tourist strip called Chicken Street.
You want map, madame?
Fawad had been doing that half his life to support a widowed mother and 7 brothers and sisters. He'd never even been able to go to a buzkashi match himself, but he has now. And tomorrow night, Fawad will not be selling maps on Chicken Street. He'll be walking on Hollywood Boulevard, here on the Oscar red carpet, with his fellow movie stars.
I cannot say my feelings because I was so happy.
There was a fundraising campaign to bring him here, but most of that can go toward education now, since the U.S. State Department and Turkish Airlines chipped in. And so a boy whose own longing is to be a pilot gets his first ride on an airplane. On the screen, Buzkashi Boy shows that because of poverty and lack of opportunity, young, dream-filled hearts are held prisoner. In real life, it is shown that every now and then, one is set free. Tom Walters, CTV News, Los Angeles.
Maybe that ending worked for you, maybe it didn't. But for sake of comparison, here's a version where I tried to just say what I think the emotional impact should be.
On the screen, the film shows a sad truth, that poverty and lack of opportunity are heartbreaking. But in real life, it's a story full of joy, and Fawad's smile makes us all happy.
I may have laid that on a bit thick, that's a bit cloying, but to me, that's like the punchline that explains too much. If I've done my job with the rest of the story, then by the time people see Fawad trying on a tux and looking at himself in the mirror, that moment will be filled with meaning. I don't have to tell anybody whether that's happy or sad. I think it's enough just to underscore the meaning of that moment. And it seems to me that emotional engagement is really the ultimate form of viewer involvement. So like letting people notice some things for themselves, I think we can involve our viewers by taking them to a place where they feel something for themselves. And often the part of the story where this kind of emotional engagement can do the greatest good is at the end. Personally, I think the last line of a story may be the most important of all. As important as the first sentence is, the last is the place where we get to leave one last lingering, resonating summation that clinches an emotional understanding of what's at stake. You know, we've probably all done this, but it's not an ending to say the trial continues tomorrow. I mean, for the same reason that a list of facts is not a story, the last fact on a list is not an ending. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. When concert pianist Van Cliburn died, I was really anxious to do an obit on him because he had been at the center of an extraordinary moment in history. In 1958, the Communist Party in Russia wanted the International Tchaikovsky competition to be proof of Soviet cultural superiority. But the winner was a 23-year-old from Texas. Now, we're talking about the darkest, most isolationist days of the Cold War, when you had two nuclear superpowers hurtling toward mutual destruction, and they got this completely unexpected moment of connection. So here's the last part of that obit.
23-year-old Texan who conquered Russia musically receives the ticker tape parade up Broadway, a hero's procession rarely if ever accorded any musician.
It was not just about a contest. Cliburn had met the enemy and made friends.
They're very sincere as a people.
Editorial cartoons showed the world coming together over a piano, something the late Walter Cronkite said was a much-needed reminder.
That there was a common bond between us all.
Cliburn seldom performed after the 70s, but he would receive the highest civilian honors of both Russia and the U.S. Gratitude for that moment in history, when humanity might have been lost to one finger on a button, but then was found in 10 of them on a keyboard. Tom Walters, CTV News, Los Angeles.
I wanted to show that example because once again, it's a case where looking at what's at stake or what was at stake then helps us to find the heart of the story. And the heart of the story is where we're going to find a satisfying ending. And I don't think it's a satisfying ending just to say Van Cliburn dead at 78. Trevor, I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit here because I see time marching on and I do want to leave room for questions, but I do want to show in closing one more clip, a whole story this time. I'll say a few quick words after that and then we'll move on to questions.
In what used to be the inside of it, Jason Pasquale is cleaning up his house. But there is still no wiping away the shock of what happened.
It was just maybe 5 or 10 seconds, then the water was deep.
He tells us flooding from the typhoon was only 10 centimeters below the roof line, and he had to lift up his 2-year-old son so he could breathe. By himself, Pasquale says he might have given up, but he would not let his child die.
It's okay if I die, but my child, I won't allow it. I won't.
Nearby at the vast New Palo Cathedral, the inside is also outside now. But 24-year-old Dennis Monterde finds shelter here anyway.
I'm picturing God sitting beside me and comforting me.
While in the broken heart of Tacloban City, searchers dig for a more material comfort. Buried canisters of cooking gas. It's practical and unsentimental work, and it says much about priorities, that out of all this debris, the goal is to remove something of use to the living, when an unmistakable smell tells us this also contains remains of the dead. In the wreckage of a neighborhood, in the shell of a home, we find the Margallo family.
I'm scared.
And their fear is what this whole region now fears, the future.
We don't have any proper shelter. We don't have anything at all. So it's like we're starting from scratch. We're starting from garbage.
But for Jason Pasquale, what gave him the will to survive the storm is what gives him the will to go on.
I'm not thinking for myself. Just for my child.
And so for his child, he cleans up the house. A house that is no longer there. Tom Walters, CTV News, Tacloban.
It's pretty easy to see what's at stake in a disaster zone. It's survival. And the focus of that story was obviously about the will to survive, how people find that will. And there are a few things there that I think are worth looking at because they engage the emotions. Jason Pasquale obviously is telling us in already emotional terms that what keeps him going is providing for his family. For Dennis Monterde, it's faith. But I think what adds emotional understanding here is recognizing just how profoundly they need these things to hang on to. You know, even for the people digging for cooking gas, we know how important that is to them by what they're not doing. They're not tending to the dead, and pretty well every society places a high priority on doing that. Dennis Monterde in our story is hanging on to faith while we see him sitting in a shattered cathedral. Jason Pasquale needs to think he's providing for his family so much that he'll do it in a way that we see in the end is futile. So I'd like to think that this is a story that does what we set out to do, that leaves the viewer with an emotional understanding of what's at stake. Questions?
All right, Tom, well, thank you very much for that. I just wanted to start with one perhaps of our own, because we were sort of talking about this the other day and during our rehearsal, and we sort of we're throwing it back and forth. So I guess I would ask, is it realistic to sort of put these into practice every single day?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because, you know, I would hate to see anybody come away from a session like this thinking, oh, all they talked about was, you know, how to tell some kind of ideal story on some kind of perfect day, you know, when everything's going our way under perfect conditions. The reality is there are always obstacles to what we do. And some days things go our way, some days they don't. if the measure of success was turning every story into some kind of, polished gem, I would certainly fail that test a lot of days. Yes, we want to do the best job we can every day, but the days that go our way aren't really the problem so much. We should be able to do a pretty good story when conditions are ideal. So I think the bigger challenge is how we apply this, on a daily basis or a close to daily basis. It's how we raise the bar on the hard days. In a way, being able to raise the ceiling on our work to make our best stories on our best days even better is nice, but I don't think that's as important as raising the floor. How do we get to the point where we can do a pretty decent job even when we're having a really tough day? I came to realize a while ago that I would do some of the most important stories I ever did when I was not at my best, on some of my worst days. I was in February, I covered the earthquake in Turkey. And in the first 48 hours of that assignment, I think I got 30 minutes of sleep. That's not a complaint. I love what I do. And most of my life is more comfortable than that. But there are going to be stories like that sometimes. And, we just looked at that story from the Philippines. And, the previous night, I think I'd had 2 hours sleep on a 50-kilo sack of raw sugar in some busted up trucking yard. And so I'm tired. The air is full of smoke because people burn stuff for warmth or for cooking. There's a smell of decomposition. I was not at my best. And while we just broke down how that story might have made emotional connections, I wasn't spending a lot of time thinking about that at the time. It's that I've been telling stories a certain way for a long time. And some of those things are habit. They're my default. And I think professional development is about maybe getting a new perspective on what we're trying to do or a few ideas we can apply, and then doing what we can with that when we can. So, to answer your question directly, it's doing what we can when we can, so that those things start to become part of our habit, part of our default. It seems to be the whole point of a session like this, of backing up a step and taking a look at what we do and how we do it, is because we don't really get a chance to do that most days when we're in the trenches. And so, when we go back to the trenches, we don't necessarily throw everything we've got at every story. We look for what we can apply and we apply it where we can. And if we do that a few times, those just become part of the things we know how to do.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions coming in. First one, how do journalists, or how do you keep going with all these events, bad events piling up? And I think she just mentioned a couple there. So what's your answer to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I take a certain amount of comfort from the knowledge that what we do as journalists is that we document exceptions to the norm. And I think it's hard for viewers, and maybe we're not doing a clear enough job in explaining to viewers that we are showing exceptions to the norm. Our role in society is more diagnostic than prescriptive. We look for the potholes so society can decide whether or not to fill them. And yes, it gives us a perspective where we're looking at a lot of potholes. I think, though, the comfort that I take in having to cover some of those stories is that, where you see tragedy, where you see disaster, you also see enormous strength. You also see great generosity and goodwill. You see people doing extraordinary things. And for me, in a way, the satisfaction of doing those stories is what they reveal about human nature. If a story about an earthquake or a typhoon is really just about broken buildings and lost lives, I probably would get tired of that. But it's about what makes people who they are. You get to see things from people in those moments that tell you something about the human condition. I remember elsewhere doing that story in the Philippines during the typhoon. I remember seeing an Arab beach area that was just, it was all mud and debris. There was just nothing left. And there was a guy there with a little blue plastic, little blue plastic basin, a dishpan. He's down on the beach and he's got water. He's washing his clothes. In the midst of all of this destruction and despair, here's somebody just connecting with some little moment of what's normal. And I find that interesting and in some surprising ways and in surprising places, uplifting.
The next one here, and I think it's a pretty good one. Do you have a sense of what the feel or emotion is going in, or is it revealed to you as you show up and start talking to people, etc.?
That's a great question, and the answer varies, because if you're going into a disaster zone, you have a rough idea of what you're there to find. I think you want, as far as possible, to be open to what you receive in the field. I don't like the idea of starting with a preconception of what the real focus and point of the story is going to be, because I think you do find that, and you have to be open to the possibility that the story is not quite what you imagined, and that you're going to hear some argument that affects your view of that story. You're going to hear a point of view that affects your view of that story. So I think you often have some sense of what the feeling is going to be, but you've got to be open to hearing it from the people who are actually feeling it.
For complex stories where there's a lot of points of view or nuance, how do you distill all that down to a 2-minute package or even less sometimes?
That is the toughest thing. I mean, probably the largest part of what I do in a day when I'm telling a story is planning out the structure of the story, deciding the sequence of events in the story, because you need to know certain things in a certain order for the next thing to make sense. But there's no perfect answer to that question. There are always going to be stories where you have to say, okay, for the purposes of this story, I'm going to separate this idea from this idea, even though they're closely tied. The challenge is how you make sure that the part that you select is still reflective of some kind of balance. You get down to smaller and smaller slices of the subject to compress it. It's the difference between doing a story on education, which is a topic and vast, and doing a story about the school principal who was fired for showing 6th graders a picture of Michelangelo's David, which is very specific. So it's find the most specific thing, I would say, the story that is manageable in the 2 minutes, and then do the best job you can of achieving balance and fairness with that story.
And there are a number of questions. We're going to try to get to them, but if you're submitting a question now, I would say it might not make it, but we'll try to get through as much as we can. What's your advice for stand-ups, besides including content we don't have visuals for, essentially to cover something, it sounds like? Because I thought
Sorry,
your
I missed
Philippines one
a little
was,
bit of that question. Advice for stand-ups?
yeah, so I thought your Philippines, I think it's in reference to maybe the Philippines one, I think was so great and sort of tied everything in. So what's your advice for the perfect stand-up, I guess?
Well, I think wherever you can interact with your environment, that's gold. I mean, and we all have to do a lot of stand-ups where we're not in a position to really interact with our environment. And I think the question hints at part of the answer. The stand-up can really be a helpful way to plug a hole in the story where you don't have good visuals. I'm not sure that I've got a perfect science for doing that, but I think those points are worth remembering. Can I use this stand-up in some way illustrate something, that's first choice, right? If you can walk from point A to point B, not just for the purpose of walking somewhere, but to illustrate, the path the car took when it veered off the road, then you can, you're using the stand-up as a vehicle to tell the story. That's always worth doing if you can. Beyond that, it's the only thing I really consistently do with stand-ups is try to keep them short.
Sorry, excuse me. Do you have any advice for someone who's trying to shift from essentially just fact-based writing or sort of a straight tell to how to practice or implement some of the tips that you've mentioned today?
Well, I mean, I go back to that question and what's at stake. And I think that if you look at what's at stake, you'll be drawn to kind of the experience, the heart of the experience, and that's where you're going to find the story that connects emotionally. When I was preparing for today and I was refreshing my memory on the Ethiopian famine, I saw a story that Maclean's magazine had written about that back in 1984. And I thought, this is a perfect example of what we're talking about. Here's the lead sentence from that story in Maclean's. The horror could be read everywhere, in the vacant eyes filled with mucus and disease, in the wounds that would never heal, in the bones that would never harden. That is painful and unflinching and straight to the heart of the story. It's not inverted pyramid. It's barely one of the 5 W's, maybe. It's about people's lives. It's about people's experience. It's about what's at stake.
So we've got a couple more here. So what tips do you have for finding the characters to build your stories around?
Well, there's no science to that for sure. If you have the luxury of sort of a lot of research time to work on something, I'm not even sure that helps, because, how do you tell over email, over the phone, who's going to be the great character to talk to? For me, the easiest way to do that, and the way that generally has worked the best, is just in the field, look for somebody who's doing something interesting or has an interesting expression, or just somebody who appears to be reacting to their circumstances, reacting to what's going on, and who you think is feeling something, because somebody's really got to be feeling something to be able to convey a feeling. And one is not a guarantee of the other, but it's looking at the people in your immediate surroundings and just asking yourself, who here has may have had a particularly significant experience they can relate, and who appears to be affected by what's going on around them.
We've got a couple of sort of similar questions, so I'm going to tie them together. And that's sort of, has social media changed the way you write in journalism? And how has that done to sort of your workflow and your what has social media videos done to your workflow and your daily deliverables?
Well, I think the biggest impact that social media has had on my work is the availability of more direct experiential video. The use of user-generated content has been helpful to storytelling. There are all kinds of things we could talk about with social media, because social media has also been the platform that has contributed to undermining trust in conventional journalism. But that's a different thing, I think, than your question, which is really about what does social media do to what we do. Social media does a couple of things. As I say, it's been a great source of video. It's also a source of immediate feedback, good or bad. I mean, some of it is just colossally stupid, but you hear from people what they think about either your story or the little write-up somebody did about your story, which they may not have bothered to watch before reacting. But that real-time feedback is also worthwhile. I think it does give us a little bit more ability to kind of hear what people are thinking in real time or close to it.
I like this question. It's kind of fun. What do you argue with your editors about?
Nothing. My editors are perfect. And if any of them are on this webinar, they're perfect.
I hope that answers your question.
We don't have that much disagreement, I find. I mean, the only thing that we ever really, there's a bit of give and take in the day on what story we're actually going to do on a particular day. But no, I think it's a pretty collegial process.
What's a story that surprised you in terms of what you thought or what the focus came to be?
Wow. I'm trying to think of a good example. I think some of the political reporting that I've done has been eye-opening, because any story where you start with a preconception of what people think or what's motivating them or what kind of folks they are, any story where you start with a preconception, you should expect that preconception to be shaken. There's a sort of an image, for example, of what you might find when you're covering stories in Texas. Well, Texas is a vast state with a rich assortment of people, and Texas, I find, always surprises me. Things are not what the stereotype might suggest, or what you might expect going in. So, and what I find in a way comforting is that sometimes when you think a point of view is unreasonable, if you hear why people feel that way, it doesn't seem quite so unreasonable. And I think we need to be, it's vital in our jobs that we be open to hearing those points of view and hearing them with an open mind and hearing them with some sense of empathy for why people feel the way they do.
Okay, great. We have one more question, and I think this is a good way to end it. Yes, the video, this is being recorded and it will be made available also on the RTDNA's website. There's some of the other ones that we've done already with Keir Junos and Craig Lord, and you can find those on the RTDNA website. So to wrap it up, before that, I'll say thank you everyone for your wonderful questions. They've been really, really insightful and great. So we'll end on this one, and that's: how do you prevent yourself from getting overwhelmed?
I wish I knew the answer to that, because there are days when I feel overwhelmed. I think the reality is, it was partly what I was talking about earlier, that you sort of form habits over time, and you know what time you got to start editing, and you know what time certain things have to be done in your day, and when things are crazy and there's a lot of fur flying, as it were, you cling to and need to cling to some of those habits and some of those default mechanisms. But I don't think there's a perfect answer to that question.